This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Para Corporation, a general contractor seeking professionals who want to make a difference in the community. More at parac.com/careers.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll review the 2025 General Assembly's legislative session and how a truncated last week left some Missouri Democrats fuming. But first, many residents in the St. Louis area are reeling from a tornado that left 5 people dead and dozens injured. St. Louis resident Peyton McCulley told St. Louis Public Radio how he survived the terrifying natural disaster.
Before the tornado even happened, I was talking about how I never seen a tornado come through St. Louis, like the city part. And then as we were getting closer to home, which is around the corner, the tornado, we had to pull over because it got too dark and we couldn't see anything. So we had to pull over, and then the tornado just came right through us, and I guess something fell on the car and made the windshield go through. And we had to duck down until it was over, and then we had to get out and run.
The storm damaged thousands of buildings, has left people without power for days, and knocked down trees throughout the region. This was the first tornado to hit the city of St. Louis and cause fatalities in more than 65 years. St. Louis resident Fred Falker says he's never seen anything like what happened on Friday.
Not even close. We've had trees, big branches fall in the past, but nothing remotely like this.
In the tornado's aftermath, federal, state, and local officials are trying to help with cleanup efforts, but the recovery effort is going to take a long, long, long time. Joining me now to provide an update on where storm recovery efforts stand is St. Louis Public Radio's Chad Davis. He was one of numerous STLPR reporters who spent the past few days covering the aftermath of this storm. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Chad, if people were not paying attention or were out of town over the last few days, can you tell us exactly what happened on Friday afternoon and where this tornado passed through?
Yeah, so it was around midday, between 2 and 2:30 when the tornado kind of hit the St. Louis area. And it started around Clayton when the tornado hit. And it primarily started to move northeast across the city. So I'm sure tons of people saw photos and videos of Forest Park being devastated by, the trees that fell into the basin. And then it really went into the Central West End and then North St. Louis. So Central West End was hit pretty hard. North St. Louis was pretty much devastated, especially around Fountain Park, the Ville, O'Fallon, and it just continued to go northeast.
How strong was this tornado, according to what you've heard from the National Weather Service?
Yeah, so the NWS said it was an EF3 tornado. And so thinking about miles per hour, that's around 150 miles per hour or so. So, these were unprecedented winds, unprecedented tornado that hit the city that, like you said, we hadn't seen in decades. Very powerful.
Public officials say the storm killed 5 people, injured several dozen others, homes, particularly in North St. Louis, completely destroyed. Mm-hmm. And how did that devastation affect efforts to rescue people who survived the storm?
Yeah, well, when you have these trees that have blocked off roads, that have, fallen on homes and such, it's really hard for a lot of rescue teams to go through. So I know there were around 17 or so search and rescue teams or so that the fire chief had said had came out. And it's difficult because you just got to go through all this rubble, all this debris, and all this mess, and it's hard. It obstructs you from actually being able to help and save people.
We want to hear your story. How did the storm last Friday in the St. Louis area affect you? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK, or email us at talk@stlpr.org. Beyond the property damage and loss of life, tens of thousands of Ameren UE customers were without power over the weekend. Representatives from the utility company are now expecting it to take several more days to restore power. Just how daunting of a job is this for Ameren's workers?
Yeah, so their priority at first is, and it makes sense. Hospitals, nursing homes, fire stations, police stations, trying to make sure that they're back online and that they have service. So that's what they went to first. But then, because you have these fallen trees and you have, a lot of obstruction when it comes to trying to go to the homes and buildings, it prevents them from being able to go forward. So I actually did go on their website prior to right now, and about 30,000, maybe 27 to 30,000 people are still without power.
And that's down from like 115,000 at its height.
Exactly. So a lot has been made, a lot of progress has been made, but yeah, there is still a lot of people without power in the city.
You mentioned trees, and you spoke with Central West End resident Willow High on that subject on Friday. Here is what she had to say about how trees were affected depending on where they were in her particular neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Luckily, this street actually just cut down several very large old trees because they were just needing it and planted smaller ones. All of the streets down that way that have really, really big old trees on them it's devastated. It's really sad.
That was Central West End resident Willow High talking to St. Louis Public Radio's Chad Davis earlier this weekend. Chad, what can you tell us about these downed trees that have made life miserable for people throughout the region?
I mean, homes are now destroyed. Like, there are so many homes or trees that were uprooted that have collapsed onto homes in North City and the Central West End that I was able to see. You have trees that have destroyed cars and vehicles, trees that have just obstructed roads. I mean, the Central West End and North St. Louis, I mean, there were lines of fire trucks that were just going through on Friday that, luckily, some of the neighbors were able to take some of the trees and move branches and kind of clear out the roads. But, I mean, so much of that area was obstructed.
Tornadoes are not unusual in the St. Louis region, but they, as we mentioned, are very rare in the actual city of St. Louis. You were out in the field. You saw some things with your own eyes. Just tell us how unprecedented this was.
I haven't seen anything in the city like this as far as a tornado. One of the people I spoke with, Fred Falker, he said he had lived in that house for about 42 years, and he's never seen a storm like this. I mean, usually when you think of like tornadoes in the St. Louis area, you think of the county, you think of more rural areas in Missouri or
St.
Illinois,
Charles, Jefferson County, maybe even parts of the Metro East as well.
Exactly. So you usually think of tornadoes hitting a lot of less urban areas. So the idea that this kind of hit St. Louis, I think maybe it was 1959 was the last time.
My dad was 1 year old when he lived in Olivet, I think.
Yeah. And so that was the last time that a tornado had caused this devastation in the city. So to think that there are, people who never seen something like this, it's pretty wild.
I've seen a lot of questions, particularly on social media platforms, about whether sirens went off to alert residents, especially since the tornado came very suddenly and very quickly. Here's St. Louis Mayor Kara Spencer answering a question on that topic this weekend.
This is a serious issue. We're taking it seriously. We are looking at our internal protocols, looking to see what happened, what might not have happened. We are continuing to do an evaluation, but that is an important process here. We're focused right now on the response and making sure that we are really addressing human safety at this point, but that is absolutely on our radar to be addressing, and we'll have answers for you on that soon.
That was St. Louis Mayor Kara Spencer on Saturday night talking about sirens, warning people about the tornado or not warning people about the tornado. Chad, did you hear anything from people you talked with about whether they were prepared for this storm, or from talking with other St. Louis Public Radio colleagues? Did they hear that people didn't get warning about this?
Yeah, well, I can speak for myself for sure. I live in Tower Grove South, and I did not hear tornado sirens, go off. Now, I did get an alert on my phone, and then I did hear coworkers mention the same thing. And then when we were in the field, some of those reporters even shared that they talked to people who said that they didn't hear sirens. And I believe some did too. It's confusing right now as to kind of what happened, where people did and did not hear sirens, but I think it all took everyone by surprise.
And I believe that Mayor Spencer said there'll be more information about whether the siren system worked, I think on Tuesday, from what I heard from a previous presser. We're talking with St. Louis Public Radio's Chad Davis about his coverage and our colleagues' coverage of the deadly tornado that ripped through parts of St. Louis and St. Louis County and the Metro East on Friday. And we want to hear your story. How did the storm last Friday in the St. Louis area affect you? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Spencer said she expected the tornado caused about $1 billion in damage, something that the city would need to know before applying for federal emergency management agency-related funds. I saw a press release from Governor Mike Kehoe that process is en route right now, that he has talked with federal officials. But some of the costs may be related to like tree removal, relatively minor repairs. But what are officials and nonprofit groups and religious organizations doing to help people whose residences are uninhabitable, and especially with the bad weather we're expecting either today or tomorrow?
Yeah, so there are a lot of groups that have stepped in and have offered, assistance and services. So the Urban League, especially the location on Kings Highway, which was actually hit or was like in the path and suffered some damage. They're kind of one of the central hubs for accepting donations and such. The Red Cross has about 3 shelters, I believe, across the city, and they've been taking people in as well. Grace United Methodist, Action St. Louis, several other groups as well that have really kind of like come together to try to either raise money, provide shelters, and a lot of these places are also accepting donations. So if you have water, if you have food, if you have some things that can go towards families and people who are staying there, I know that they greatly appreciate those things and they really need it.
Speaking of FEMA, I have seen from several public officials that officials from that agency will be on the ground in St. Louis to do damage assessments, I believe, in a couple of days. Yeah. Congressman Wesley Bell said on Saturday that Missouri's federal delegation is working on delivering needed resources to the region.
A disaster declaration will allow us to utilize federal funds through agencies like FEMA to help rebuild our region. And we need to make sure that we find every dollar from every grant, from every state program, and every couch cushion to help this region.
That was Congressman Wesley Bell of St. Louis County from earlier this weekend. Chad, from what you've seen, do you think a full recovery will be possible without federal involvement?
No, not at all. It's so devastating. I think, as far as, what the governor has called for as well, he's asking for, emergency declaration for the state of Missouri, a federal emergency declaration. He's also asking, that would provide about like $5 million in immediate funding to state support to help preventive measures for emergencies. I think without any type of federal funding or involvement, it's going to take a very, very long time to really bring North St. Louis back.
Especially since there could be some homeowners that don't have insurance.
Exactly.
Or even if they do have insurance, the deductibles on some of these policies could be thousands of dollars, Absolutely. Which they may just not have right now. It seems like that is going to be the type of assistance that is going to be vital for people who especially are underinsured, don't have insurance, or have insurance and can't pay for the deductible.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what these services are for. This is what, these types of assistance programs, we need those in this area.
Let's go to Margaret from Ladue. Margaret, thank you for calling today. What's on your mind?
I grew up in the Central West End, and I remember the tornado that came down Maryland Avenue. I think that this tornado damage was worse than the tornado that hit us in 1959.
Do you happen to remember what the response was from local and state and federal officials? I don't know how old you were during that, but did you see a all hands on deck mentality when that happened?
Well, I was about 4 years old.
That's okay.
I remember my parents being very upset at the tornado, and I remember the apartment building at the intersection of Maryland Avenue having the entire rear wall removed, and how amazing I was as a 4-year-old that all of the bathrooms were above each other on every single floor. I never knew how apartment buildings looked. That's the 4-year-old's perspective.
Well, Margaret, Thank you so much for providing us with that historical perspective. And again, we want to hear your story, and we want to hear how this storm last Friday in the St. Louis area affected you. Our number is 314-382-8255. Chad, this is just an observation, but having seen some of these disaster briefings before from political leaders, I found both Mayor Spencer and Governor Kehoe provided a lot of specific information, particularly about what each layer of government was doing to deal with the damage from this storm. I think you attended a couple of these briefings. What was your kind of takeaway from how useful they were to the public?
Yeah, I think any information is better than no information. And they were really on the ground immediately, just, a few hours after the tornado, hit the region. The mayor, several representatives, police, fire, really giving briefings. I mean, they estimated the amount of people that were killed, who were injured, the different search and rescue teams that were going out. I think that the detail that city gave was critical, and I think it's really helped to kind of figure out where we go next and what needs to happen.
So I've been talking with a lot of people within the world of politics, and I know that a lot of elected officials are stepping up behind the scenes. I know that a lot of labor unions are donating supplies. I know that a lot of Ameren linemen who are union members are working their tails off to make sure that power is restored. What are some of the ways that you have seen community show up sort of organically or just beyond just political or governmental response?
A lot of people going out into North City and helping move trees and helping trying to clean up. There's a lot of that in North City, a lot of that north of Del Mar. People in the Central West End, there were people who were neighbors on Westminster Place. I think I spoke to a contractor, actually, who doesn't live there, but he was there already, and he was just chopping down trees and trying to get things off of cars. Community has just come together. A lot of people donating water, food, yeah.
I know that I guess Mayor Spencer mentioned this about self-deployment, and there's, I don't want to say controversy, but maybe some upsettedness on social media about those comments. I think it was around the fact that some of those areas are very dangerous. There may be live wires. There may be buildings that may be collapsing. But on the other hand, I also know that people helping neighbors clean up after disaster is a very common response everywhere. So what have you kind of heard about the whole concept of people trying to help spontaneously?
Well, it is a good point that when you're around live wires or unstable structures, I mean, there's an inherent risk in that you can get hurt or really, killed even. So I think a lot of people, I think the city was trying to say, hey, be careful because we do have emergency personnel, but emergency personnel is already trying to help people who are already hurt, who are already trapped, who need to get out, who need to be rescued. So in that instance, try to stay indoors if you can so that we can go out there. But, when you see, it's hard to, ignore people who are already hurt or who need that assistance and that help. So I think that's what a lot of people were responding to. Hey, my neighbor's hurt. Hey, my neighbor needs this. I need to go out to my neighbor. So I think that's what happened.
The Midwest Newsroom's Holly Edgell mentioned something poignant in her report that we played on Sunday, that the tornado affected people north and south of Del Mar. And to demystify that for people who may not understand the reference, and I'm sure everybody who lives in St. Louis does know what I'm talking about. The Del Mar Divide is often seen as the dividing point between white and black St. Louis, and in many respects, rich and poor St. Louis. So I think what Holly was trying to say is this has affected people rich and poor, black and white, east, north, south, west, everybody. But I do know there is a long history of governments leaving behind the north side in black St. Louis. Do you think that those fears are warranted here, or is it just too soon to know for sure?
I think it is warranted. It obviously the tornado hit Central West End, it hit North St. Louis, it hit black and white people and predominantly black neighborhoods in North St. Louis. And so I think the fear is, okay, well, even though we were all hit in this area, what is the response going to be? If North St. Louis has already been disinvested for so long, for decades, is there going to be a change? I think there are a lot of people who are concerned about that, who are worried about what's going to happen to those homes, those neighborhoods. And I think they just looking at history and seeing what has happened prior, those fears are very warranted.
I think that it might also bring up using the RAM settlement to rebuild parts, particularly of North City and the Central West End. I think that if that does end up happening, I think there are going to be big questions on how that's executed, who would benefit from that. But I say who would benefit from that, would the people who lost their homes completely and maybe can't get access to FEMA-related money or state-related money, would that be something that could be used to help them? I think these are unanswered questions. As Mayor Spencer has said, we're still in the recovery effort of the storm before we start talking about next steps. But I do think we need to put those down as markers now that that response is going to need to be watched very closely.
Definitely.
Well, Chad, thank you so much for everything that you've done and spending the weekend covering the aftermath of Friday's St. Louis tornado. For all of our coverage, make sure you go to STLPR.org. Make sure you go to St. Louis Public Radio's Instagram page for photos, video, and vital information about recovery efforts. Chad, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much for your great work over the weekend.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, we'll talk about the end of the 2025 legislative session. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Is it possible for something to be unusual and familiar at the same time? Well, in some respects, the 2025 legislative session encapsulates that admittingly paradoxical concept. Unlike the last couple of years, Republicans generally got along with each other and passed much of Governor Mike Kehoe's agenda, but to approve two measures to counteract voter-approved paid sick leave and abortion measures, Senate Republicans needed to use what's known as the previous question to shut down Democratic filibusters. And then the Senate adjourned on Wednesday, while the House called it quits on Thursday for the first time in years. With Democratic senators promising procedural retribution, it may be a good time to bring in St. Louis Public Radio State House and politics reporter Sarah Kellogg to discuss how the end of this unusual week may lead to less fruitful legislative sessions in the future. Sarah, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, Jason. As always, it's good to be back.
So I thought it was an unusual legislative session. Did you also find it different from the others you covered?
I really did. And up until the last week or half or so, I would say this session is probably the calmest one I've covered. And this is my fourth session. And the biggest difference I saw was, less of a fractions and fictions in the Republicans in the Senate, as well as more cooperation between the Senate and House as a whole. And we'll get to how all of that ended, I'm sure. But it ultimately did lead to more legislation passing compared to last year. 67 bills passed this year, which is 51 of those were non-appropriations. Compare that to 46 last year. That's 20 more bills.
You mentioned this, but a less covered subplot revolved around how the Freedom Caucus in the Senate actually worked with Senate leadership instead of being, and excuse the pejorative here, just straight up obstructionists. How do you think that affected harmony within the Senate GOP caucus and with House and Senate relations?
I think it meant more bills got through. I was kind of racking my brain this morning, and I can't really think of an issue where members of the Freedom Caucus delayed or stopped a bill for hours on end because they wanted something else passed. Last year there were hours-long holdups on gubernatorial appointments, as well as the federal reimbursement allowance, which funds roughly 1/3 of Medicaid in the state. The FRA filibuster actually briefly broke the filibuster record before Democrats took back a couple weeks later. This year, I can't think of a similar situation. So I think that led to a more united Republican Party this year and for more bills to go through.
I saw Governor Kehoe walk through the halls of the Capitol's third floor multiple times over the last week of session. First of all, was that common throughout the year? And how do you think his personal charm offensive on legislators helped pass elements of his agenda?
I can't really say how common it was, as I was either in the House or the Senate during those walks.
Fair
At a
enough.
press conference last Friday, Keogh said he made a point to visit with lawmakers throughout session. I think it showed that he was more involved while session was ongoing compared to his predecessor, Governor Mike Parson. And, I think it did help. His number one priority was a bill that had numerous provisions related to police as well as public safety. Kind of the big headline of that one is it included placing the St. Louis Police Department under a state board. And that was the first bill passed, and it was passed in mid-March. That's very early for something to make it through both chambers. So, I do think it made a difference.
It wasn't all sunshine and roses, though. State Representative LaDonna Applebaum wrote on Facebook, "Please tell us the story of the elevator ride with House Majority Leader Alex Riley. You had me in tears." So what the representative is referring to is how I told the House Majority Leader, "Saw you on TV yesterday, must have been filmed before Friday." And that was when he was doing a television interview about how the budget went well this year. And it was clearly filmed before a capital improvement bill surprisingly went down in flames. How did that affect the last week of session that bill did not make it over the finish line?
I think it had a pretty big effect. For some context, the bill in question was House Bill 19, and it was just one vote away in the House from going to Governor Kehoe. And without telling House Democrats or the Senate at all, House Republicans, namely Budget Chair Dirk Deaton, did not bring that bill up for a vote. They skipped it. And Deaton says he made that move because he felt the budget was just getting too big for the year. And for context, House Bill 19 was roughly $500 million. That did not go over well in the Senate, especially with Senator Lincoln Huff, who's the appropriations chair in the Senate. He spoke on the floor with other senators about the consequences of not passing that budget bill. It was going to fund projects all over the state, including money for several hospitals as well as for cancer research. And then the House passed legislation to improve/fund stadiums for the Kansas City Chiefs and Royals. That could cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and sent that to the Senate, where that went over pretty much like a lead balloon. Huff noted the hypocrisy of not funding 19, but being willing to fund for that stadium. So, no bills passed the Senate on Monday. I think that was a consequence of 19. And that stadium bill did not pass, which I think was a direct consequence of that.
And some listeners like Joni Hosher wrote, how can the Republicans in Missouri ignore the will of the people, this time abortion, but also concealed carry, right to work, expanding Medicaid? Those are just off the top of my head. Oh, yeah, paid sick leave. So what she's referring to is how the previous question, which ends Democratic filibusters in the Senate, were used to pass a measure repealing elements of Proposition A on the paid sick leave requirements and to put something else on the ballot to repeal and replace an abortion rights constitutional amendment that voters approved in 2024. What are Republicans saying when they're passing these bills overriding voter-approved initiatives?
So obviously I'll preface by saying I'm not a Republican lawmaker, but I think there's two talking points from the House and Senate Republicans on this issue. One is that voters didn't know what they were voting for when they voted for Amendment 3 in Proposition A back in November. And once they saw how these measures would be implemented practically, that some regretted their vote. Is that a possibility for some voters? I'm sure. When you only have the ballot summary, the nitty-gritty of what the amendment or statutes actually do are more complicated and not on the ballot. We've talked about that with sports betting. I want to note that some Republicans, like Speaker of the House John Patterson, does not subscribe to that idea. He thinks voters knew exactly what they were voting for. And that kind of leads to the other talking point, which is that, yes, the voters passed Amendment 3 and Proposition A, and Republicans are putting forth a new option for voters to decide to pass or fail on Amendment 3. Or in the Proposition A situation, they repealed sick leave and future wage increases beginning in 2027, but they kept in place the $15 an hour minimum wage increase in 26. So their argument is that it's a compromise. I don't know if Missourians will see it that way, months later to repeal something in part that the voters approved of, but I think those are two kind of the arguments that you see.
Senate Democrats say they plan to tie the chamber into procedural gridlock over the previous question on those two measures. Do you think they'll follow through, and if so, how?
I don't think we're going to have to wait long to see if they'll follow through, because we're likely going to have a special session in the following month. But the anger from Senate Democrats was really palpable last Wednesday. And there's a lot someone can do to throw sand in the gears and bring the Senate down to a crawl. That could be objecting motions that kind of go by normally, to filibuster any bill, any motion that goes through. I think that we've seen it before, not used, kind of step by step by Republican or by Democrats, but by members of the former conservative caucus. But, I look, and also in addition to that, I look at the voting tallies for the budget this year. And if I removed all of the aye votes from Democrats, a lot of budget bills would not pass. And so I think that could be something that comes up next year as well.
Sarah Kellogg is St. Louis Public Radio State House and politics reporter. Sarah, thank you for coming back on the show. And more importantly, thank you for your stellar work along with star intern Evie Lewis for all session long providing us with the information they needed to know. So I appreciate you.
Absolutely. I'm going to brag on myself and say it was definitely a dream team between me and Evie. So thanks so much. And I guess till next year or till next month, huh?
Until next month. When we come back, we'll continue our review of the 2025 legislative session with State Representatives Ian Mackey and Jim Murphy. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. When Governor Mike Kehoe held his end-of-session press conference, he urged reporters and Missourians to examine the 2025 legislative session in its entirety rather than just the chaotic final days. And he also said he understood why Democrats were not happy with what happened last week.
Yeah, it's part of how this building works. People also are people. They have emotions, right? And so sometimes it hits a raw nerve, and time and relationship building is usually the thing that cures that. I don't want to make that sound easy or simple or a snap of a finger, because it's certainly not. But it will take a little bit of rebuilding of some relationships, and I know that folks from both parties and both sides of the building will work hard to try to rebuild those relationships.
Joining us now to assess whether legislators can really get along in subsequent sessions are State Representatives Ian Mackey and Jim Murphy. Mackey represents Missouri's 99th House District, which takes in Clayton, Ladue, Olivet, and Warson Woods. Representative, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Murphy represents Missouri's 94th House District, which takes in portions of South St. Louis County. Representative, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get into what happened in the legislature, I do want to ask both of you if you think there will need to be any state legislative actions in response to the tornadoes, even if it's just like appropriating extra money that could reimburse municipalities or utility companies. And I know this is a very speculative question, and we're only 3 days out, but I do want to ask while both of you are here. Representative Murphy.
Well, actually, the stories you're hearing, we're finding out that our government has responsibilities, and this is no different than what happened out in California when they had the fires. Because now we have a situation where we have mass destruction, and what are we going to do to rebuild? And the stories I'm hearing is the red tape now is going to become a real issue, and we have let that red tape grow and grow and grow over a period of time. A good example is I was fortunate enough in November to decide I wanted to have a whole house generator put in. And it took me 3 months to get a permit to do it. If that's going to happen on the rebuilding end of this, and I'm sure it will, because it's, we have let this monster grow, it's a real problem. My electrical contractor told me today he's had 100 calls wanting these generators put in now because of what people have gone through.
Now, Representative Mackey, you mentioned to me you're still without power in your house in Clayton, or your condo in Clayton?
Yeah, our apartment, yep.
How do you think local, state, and federal officials have handled the response to the storm? And what do you, I can't say I disagree with Representative Murphy that how things go forward, especially with the federal government's response, is going to be really critical here.
Right. Yeah, I was glad to see Governor Kehoe step in and, invite FEMA and declare a disaster, seek federal aid. My understanding is that they're going to do a damage assessment. FEMA is on Wednesday. People are ready to fill out their applications right now. I hope that this isn't a case of the federal government dragging their feet. Obviously, with $1 billion worth of damage, that's not something the city or any city can shoulder on its own. It's going to need, obviously, a lot of federal support and probably some state support. And I certainly agree with, what we can do to cut red tape. We did leave $1 billion, close to it, I think, on the table when it comes to finances. But I think cutting red tape is also something that we're going to have to do as well.
All right. Do you have anything else to add on that point?
Yeah, another thing we have to be very cautious of is the people are going to be out here taking advantage of people. For example, I had an inspector come out, and he was kind of a strange dude. And when I checked him out, he had a criminal background, and I'm going, they're sending out, people that haven't been background checked, and they're roaming our neighborhoods. We as a government, we need to be looking at that and making sure that our citizens aren't being taken advantage of.
And there certainly are examples of reputable contractors who, may have committed crimes 30 years ago and have repaid their debt to society.
Absolutely.
So I want to make that clear. But it could be people who have recently ripped people off.
Right, and there's going to be gypsy crews coming in now that we have no idea who they are, and they're not going to be looking out for our citizens. We need to do that for them.
All right, let's move to what the legislature did and didn't do this year. Representative Murphy, how would this session compare to prior years?
Oh, I think the session was incredibly successful. We passed some great education reforms. We passed one of my favorites, of course, was my baby box program, which we got funding for from the state. That is actually saving lives. It's moved very smoothly. I think the Democrats, Republicans both feel like we got to debate good, solid legislation on the floor. There's a couple of controversial things that went out there, but we weren't consumed by it like we have in the past. And the Senate wasn't consumed with it as they were in the past. So we actually got things accomplished. We didn't always agree on everything, but I think it was overall a very good session.
Representative Mackey, it did seem that the lack of infighting among Republicans may have put Democrats at a disadvantage. How was your caucus able to deal with that reality?
I think on the House side, I really agree with Jim in terms of just the general sense and feeling on the House side. To me, after having been there for 7 years, this was the best of those 7 years on our side of the building. Like Representative Murphy said, we did not have fights for the sake of having fights. Every year I've been there, we've had a floor leader who would bring up a bill just so we could spend 2 or 3 hours debating abortion or trans kids or something, that he knew was going to divide everybody, get everybody mad, lock people in until 10 or 11 o'clock at night just to have the fight, just to get clips, just to make people angry. We didn't do any of that. We debated legislation that we disagreed on, but legislation that historically has divided Republicans and Democrats, right? Sure. ESA, school vouchers. That's something Democrats and Republicans should be debating. There's merit to both sides of the point of view, and that's what we spent our time doing in the House, and I'm glad we did.
So while there did seem to be less House and Senate friction as a whole, the decision not to pass HB 19, the capital improvements bill, seemed to leave a bad taste in a lot of senators' mouths. I'm sure, Representative Murphy, you heard heavy criticism of senators, of House Budget Chairman Dirk Deaton for not putting that bill forward. Was it the right move?
Well, 18, 19, 20 wasn't even brought up into committee by the Senate until Wednesday of the week, final week. We told them early on, you had this bill since the 7th of April. Let's get it through committee so we can talk about any changes and so forth. They purposely delayed it and sent it over to us with an extra $110 million added to it 2 hours before the end of the day, and they adjourned, giving us no chance to take it to a
Now,
conference.
Senator Huff said some of that additional money came from House member requests. Is that true?
No.
It's not true?
What they put on the floor was not anything we told them to put on.
Okay. Well, to play devil's advocate, the legislature has passed a major tax cut, and the economy may be heading into a downturn. Representative Mackey, do you think the House's decision here may have actually been a blessing in disguise?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think the folks across the state relying on those capital improvements that desperately need to happen are thinking the same either. Investments in our state are incredibly important. And the folks who are relying on that are now left in the dark because of political infighting between the House and Senate. I don't think that's a blessing in disguise. I think to address our shortfalls in the future, we have to be more responsible when it comes to how we handle our taxes. And we can't just continue to follow the route of Kansas and brown back ourselves into oblivion and cut, and then wake up surprised that we don't have any money.
Do you have a response to that?
Well, I would say this, that the bottom line is a little over $1.2 billion now. If we'd have passed 19, it would have been well under $1 billion with an economic situation coming down the road where that money's going to be needed. And, we're trying to protect that bottom line. And we made that perfectly clear from day one with the Senate that we weren't going to be railroaded, because it's a trend that they've set. And there is some time or another that you have to put your foot down and say, enough is enough. This was it. I believe that the governor is going to bring us back for a special. We're going to renew some of those things, and I think we should. But helter-skelter spending is just something that we shouldn't be doing.
We'll be following that more when the governor does his special session call. But I do want to move on to the reaction to the GOP-controlled legislature taking aim at Proposition A and Amendment 3. And we got a lot of comments like this from that sailor girl on Instagram who wrote, "I am not forgiving or forgetting that this gerrymandered GOP legislature has managed to reverse or scuttle every proposition victory of Mo voters in the last 2 decades. I am furious with them and tired of them sabotaging the 2 Democratic cities at every turn while taking our money." Now, I want to make it clear the legislature has not overridden every proposition that has been done. As far as I know, we're not revoting on sports betting, even though that only passed by like 1,000 votes. But Representative Murphy, what do you think of your party? Do you think your party's going to face a backlash for what they did?
We might. But, I don't think I make decisions based on what voters will punish me for. I have to base it based on what I think is the right thing to do. When it comes to Proposition A, every business in my community came to me crying that this is going to hurt us. It's going to cost jobs. It's going to possibly run us out of business. It was just overly done. Nobody thought it through. And I don't believe that the voters have the responsibility of knowing everything that could possibly happen if they vote for this. It sounded very good. I think probably we should look at some legislation to do that, but do it in a responsible way. This was just way too broad. We needed to do something about it. The minimum wage was not an issue. We didn't touch that. So that was something that I felt like we needed to do, because our process is long and drawn out. Our debates are long and drawn out. We vet bills in many, many ways, whether it be committee, on the floor, when it goes to the Senate, when it comes back. The initiative petition process is not nearly thorough enough. And sometimes we make mistakes. We make them as a legislature. We'll pass bills that need to be fixed. This was a bill I believe needed to be fixed, and we did.
So, Representative Mackey, I have heard a lot from business groups about how small businesses felt like they were being overwhelmed by these sick leave requirements. Was there a way to possibly make it easier for them? Or do you think that it was just impossible for Democrats to get behind it because they've latched onto this idea that any voter-approved initiative needs to be respected, even if they don't like it?
Well, it could be. I think a lot of the negotiations did deal with the size of business. I think that was a big sticking point to determine, to what extent is a burden too great for a business of a certain size? I mean, I think that's really what a lot of folks in the Senate on both parties were trying to figure out. No, I'm not somebody that thinks we need to respect the will of voters no matter what. Why? Because we have a ban on gay marriage in the Constitution from 2004, passed by 70% of Missourians. No. I agree with
you wouldn't have been able to get married under that.
Absolutely. And you know what? If I had the opportunity to overturn that 2 days later as a legislature, you bet you I would. So it's not that simple. And no, I don't think friends like Representative Murphy and other Republicans are going to face consequences as long as voters can have their cake and eat it too. You go back to 1999, we said no to concealed carry. You go back decades, puppy mills. You can go through the list. What happened? Did they face consequences? No. There were people on my street that had yard signs up that said yes on 3, vote for Mike Kehoe for governor. Did that make sense to me? Absolutely not. But as long as folks can have their cake and eat it too, I think this is the state we're in, and we're in this doom loop where we continue to have proposition after proposition. People get rich off them, they put them on the ballot, they make money off them, the consultants go away happy, and then we just keep this loop going.
I do want to talk about the measure that would seek to repeal and replace Amendment 3. And I want to focus on one thing that I don't think has gotten as much of attention, but it's a provision that bans things like gender transition surgery and hormone therapy for minors, which is already illegal under state law. I understand that there is a sunset on it, and there was a bill to try to remove it that didn't end up getting passed. But why was that language in the amendment, since it's not allowed for most cases right now?
Well, first of all, we're not overturning Amendment 3. I mean, we're giving the voters another choice. I think Representative Sykes, when he closed on the floor debate, I think put it right, that when we did 126, which was the heartbeat bill, that a majority of Missourians felt like maybe it was a little too far. We are a pro-life state. That's well documented, but it went too far. When they got Amendment 3 in front of them, they said, "Oh, well, this is a way to bring it back." But on second read, it's a little bit too much. We've never given them a choice in the middle, and we think now we're giving them a choice in the middle. As far as the transgender part, frankly, I don't know why we're doing that. I think that that's a separate issue that should have been handled separately. And if I don't like mixing the two, but if that's the way the bill came out, that's the way the bill came out.
I do want to ask both of you if you think the ballot summary will stand up to judicial scrutiny. It doesn't mention that most abortions would be banned if this proposal passes, with the exception of rape and incest up to 12 weeks of pregnancy, fatal fetal abnormalities, and medical emergencies. And this may seem like nitpicking, but the bullet point that says it would protect kids against gender transition, that just seems factually inaccurate, because if the kid is born intersex, they would still have access to things like gender transition surgery. So Representative Murphy first, and then Representative Mackey, do you think the ballot summary is going to survive judicial scrutiny?
I never bet on what the courts will do.
Fair.
I don't believe I would ever win that bet if I did it. I don't know. I think they'll probably come up with something more centralist, and we'll see what happens. But I do believe that when you look at Amendment 3, it only passed by 1.3%. I think this is going to be a very different election when it comes out, and who's going to punish me? Which half of the 50%? I don't know.
Well,
yeah, I'm sure it'll be rewritten. I sure hope it will be to reflect a more fair representation of what's actually in the ballot language, as is typically the case when these issues go to the ballot.
Do you think that Amendment 3, as is now, will survive this challenge? Like, I do know from talking with people that the anti-abortion rights sentiment is really strong among everyday people because they feel that abortion is morally wrong. I know that Amendment 3 passed, but Representative Murphy is right that it was pretty close. How do you think that amendment that was passed last year will fare when it gets another shot in 2026?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm old enough to remember passing Clean Missouri, and then 2 years later, not same electorate, obviously, but voters across the state who put Clean Missouri in, I think in 2018, turned around in 2020, took it right back out. So, I think the same thing could happen here. Obviously, the trans language is ballot candy that's meant to get people's attention. What I think is going to happen is this isn't going to be an issue from the folks who are putting it on the ballot and wanting it to pass. It's not going to be about abortion. You're not going to see ads saying 12 weeks or abortion is murder, or trying to convince people to be pro-life who aren't. What it's going to say is trans kids, trans kids, trans kids. That's what the ad's going to be from these folks.
30 seconds left. You guys are going to be coming back into special session to talk about the Chiefs and the Royals. Do you think that the harsh feelings we alluded to earlier are going to make it hard to pass? Representative Murphy.
I certainly hope not. I think this is an issue that, and we had discussed it earlier, there's really two sides to this. One's a political side and one's an economic side. Economically, it makes sense for us to do this. Politically, it's a terrible vote for us to take. But the economics matter.
Representative Mackey.
It's going to be a hell of a fight. I hope we can get it done. But I don't think people's feelings have evaporated since we adjourned.
Well, Representatives Ian Mackey and Representative Jim Murphy, thank you so much for being here today. And you're both term limited after this year.
That's right. We both have senioritis.
So you all have senioritis. Thank you for joining us today.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.